Well, with the vaccine rollout starting later this month, what sort of a year are we looking at? Let's again welcome Professor Peter Collignon. Peter, thanks for joining us. Obviously, just one case now in each of Perth and Melbourne. Testing so far and contact tracing hasn't turned up any further spread from those infections. First up, there's a lot of talk about the new UK variant and that it is more highly infectious. Then why haven't we seen more infections?
Well, I think there's more strains in the UK in particular, but it's still not absolutely clear how much that is due to the movement of people and people carrying the virus versus the virus itself. If you look at Brisbane that had the UK strain, you'd actually say it was less infectious than other strains, given the number of people that weren't infected. And it's the same sort of elsewhere. We've had a lot of these strains so far, and at least from an Australian perspective, it hasn't behaved differently. It spreads the same way. It's still mainly through droplets, even though people talk about aerosols. They're a minor factor compared to being close to people who are infected, or maybe getting it via your hands and self-contaminating yourself. So what we need to do is the same as we've done all the time. We need to not become complacent. We've got a problem year ahead of us, in my view. We're not going to be out of this for at least another year or probably 2 years. We're going to have to keep on a lot of restrictions that have worked for the next year. And we need to go back and look at Australia has been a great success story. The only failure was Melbourne in winter. And there were a lot of factors that were responsible for that, other than poor training of infection control guards, not having good contact tracing initially, testing maybe not even being accurate, not identifying places that had infections, etc., and people who were infected not being home when they were supposed to be. Now, all of those things have been fixed. And if you look at every other outbreak we've had in Australia, they've all been contained, whether it was northwest Tasmania, whether it was Adelaide, whether it was Brisbane on a couple of occasions, Sydney on numerous occasions. They've all got on top of it. It's been suppressed and, in fact, eliminated. So we can get on top of this without, in fact, I think even having citywide lockdowns. I mean, both Melbourne and Sydney in the last month or so, there's been 3 outbreaks, 2 in Sydney and 1 in Melbourne. All of those were contained by the standard, a lot of testing, people cooperating and case quarantine, etc., close contact, and that works. So it's hard to see what short lockdowns do in addition if you've got good testing and good case finding, because you get a lot of economic and social pain. And from what I can see so far, little gain or maybe no gain from an infection control point of view.
We just got to call this out then. It's just an overreaction, isn't it? And it's unnecessary. I mean, I found myself watching Daniel Andrews live on Sky News last night, and I was relieved after what we saw in Perth and Brisbane. Wow, at least he hasn't gone into lockdown again over just one case.
I think lockdowns have a place, or severe restrictions, but it's when you've got lots of mystery cases where you don't know where they're coming from. Yeah. Now, Melbourne was obviously in that situation. You have to have severe restrictions on people moving. But you've got to remember, the people that are exempted from those movements are the essential workers. And even in Melbourne, they were responsible for a lot of, bringing infection back into the community or to their families. So, particularly when you've got low cases, and our success rate in Australia has been very good at being able to contain this by having, good public health responses and getting on top of it. So, I think instead of looking at the one failure we had, which was Melbourne last winter, we should look at the numerous successes and say, hey, we can get on top of this, particularly in summer compared to winter. Winter, we may have to have slightly stricter rules. But, to some degree, what worries me about this elimination is that people think we can go back to normal. I don't think we can for a while. South Australia saying they're going to have almost full football crowds this winter. I think that's not a great idea. I think we should have crowds, but we're going to have to limit them, particularly in winter, because this can so easily come back and spread. We've got to do things that we know that stop the spread, but allow us to still have a reasonable life and reasonable travel and whatever within the constraints of making sure it doesn't spread too far.
Yeah, well said. I think one of the key realities here, there's been an enormous overreaction about how the virus has come in to these 2 infections, one in Perth, one in Melbourne. I mean, it's obvious. Obviously, it's come through hotel quarantine. It's been picked up by work. And now, of course, you want to investigate and make sure that there's been no infection control breaches. But it is inevitable, isn't it, if we're bringing people into this country through hotel quarantine, because this virus is so highly infectious, even with the best will in the world, we need to expect that it will escape occasionally.
The more people we bring back, the more it will happen. But again, on all occasions in the last 6 months, we've got on top of it.
Yeah.
And the one thing I think we don't do well enough in quarantine hotels, eyes are a good way of getting infection. And we often see people with masks, but often not, well, like photos I've seen around Australia, not always face shields. So I think we need to protect eyes more. I think we need to have a quality assurance system that we agree on minimum standards, and other people from outside your state, New South Wales can look at Victoria, Victoria can look at New South Wales, Queensland, whatever. They go and look and check that it looks like it's up to scratch. We do that for laboratories and procedures that we need to be good. I think we need to expand that to quarantine hotels, because this is going to be an issue for at least another year and maybe a couple of years. And they are the most dangerous way for the virus to come back, now that we've fixed airline crew, because they were, I think, might have even been responsible for the Avalon outbreak in Sydney in retrospect. But the quarantine hotels are our biggest risk, where we need to immunise all the people associated. But equally, we've got to make sure the more important things, the procedures, are done all the time consistently, and have the backup of good case finding, good testing, etc., so that if any does escape, we can get on top of it very quickly when the numbers are small. And look again at New South Wales. They can even have more than 100 cases, but you can get on top of it. 30 cases in Melbourne, you can get on top of it, providing you act quickly with lots of case finding, quarantine, isolation of cases, and quarantine of close contacts.
Yeah, I mean, you're so right. We should be encouraged by our record rather than perturbed by it. I just want to get your thoughts, Peter, before I let you go, on the vaccine situation. An extra 10 million doses of Pfizer vaccine has been ordered by the federal government now. Rollout starts the end of this month. Are you happy with the mix, the extent and the timing of the vaccine supplies for Australia?
Well, I think we've actually got contracts for 3 times our population. So, yeah, we're getting enough vaccine. We don't actually know how all these vaccines are going to work in reality in the field. I mean, luckily in Australia, we've got so low transmission, we can see what happens in America, in Europe, in Britain, and which is the best vaccine in different areas. And they're going to have to get better with time as well. But we also got to make sure that we vaccinate the most at-risk people, which are people over the age of 70, those with underlying medical conditions that are younger than that, our first-line quarantine workers, and then also our healthcare workers. But after that, you've got to remember, if you're a 30-year-old and get COVID, your chance of dying from it is about 1 in 10,000. Now, that's, you still should try and avoid that, but that's compared to somebody who's 85 in a nursing home, where it might be 1 in 3. So we also got to be careful. There's a lot of places around the world where we're not going to go back to normal until we can vaccinate them. So we do also have to look at the ethics of using all the vaccine because we're rich, and not allowing poorer countries where we've got a lot of vaccine, or a lot of virus circulating, but not letting their elderly people, for instance, get the vaccine before our 30-year-olds, when we hope we have no transmission. So there's other issues I think we have to talk about, with not putting ourselves absolutely at the front of the queue for everyone, and considering others around the world as well.
Yeah, well said again. I appreciate your time, Peter.
Thank you.
Professor Peter Collignon there from the Australian National University.